Well, today we's in for a treat. Geisler and Turek is going to give us the top 10 reasons why we ought to trust the New Testament to be reliable. Considering that they's both highly dedicated evangelists with Ph.D. in Bible-related studies, they's well qualified to give us the very best apologetic arguments you can get. And they do. But just 'cause they's the best arguments you can find, don't necessarily mean any of them's any good. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Today we's up to chapter 11, and the title promises that this chapter will give us, quote, the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth, end quote. And if these is the top 10, that means that none of the other arguments for New Testament reliability is going to be as good. So if these arguments don't do the job, we don't even need to look at the others. So we got a lot to cover here. Let's just jump right on in. The first argument is an embarrassment. No, literally, let me just read it to you. Quote, the New Testament writers include embarrassing details about themselves. End quote. So yeah, this argument is known as the criterion of embarrassment, and the basic idea is that folks don't like to make themselves look bad, so any stories in the Bible that make the disciples look bad is probably true. If we write a story about ourselves, we ain't going to make up stuff to make ourselves look bad, so the only reason we would have to tell on ourselves would be because it was actually true. And that sounds plausible, don't it? Geisler and Turek back up this argument with several examples of the disciples missing the point and having doubts and getting chewed out by Jesus and basically screwing up. And for Geisler and Turek, that settles the issue. Quote, in short, we don't have enough faith to believe that the New Testament writers included all of those embarrassing details in a made-up story. The best explanation is that they were really telling the truth, warts and all, end quote. But of course, that's the conclusion they want to reach, so they ain't mentioning all the relevant details. For example, the people writing these stories ain't the people who was screwing up in the stories. And that's a minor point, but it's worth mentioning. The bigger point is that the gospel is a before and after story. Before the supposed resurrection, the disciples was ordinary, flawed, fallible human beings just like everybody else. But after the supposed resurrection, they was transformed. And the worse they was before the transformation, the bigger and more impressive the transformation. If you've ever heard Christians giving their testimony, you know that believers love their before and after stories. Oh, I was a drug addict. I was one of them surly, superior atheists. I was a high priest in a satanic cult. But then I found Jesus. Would a believer invent salacious details about their own past in order to have a more impressive conversion story? Well, I know I was tempted to. I went from being a well-behaved mainline Christian kid to being a well-behaved evangelical Christian kid. When I gave my testimony, folks was just waiting for me to be done so they could hear someone else tell a more dramatic story. I envied folks who could claim they was alcoholics or muggers or whatever. So yeah, there's actually some pretty strong psychological motivations that could easily have led New Testament writers to cast the pre-resurrection disciples in as unfavorable a role as they could get away with. Also, a big part of the impetus behind the growth of Christianity was the cognitive dissonance that hit them when their beloved and righteous teacher was executed. They'd been hoping for a Messiah who would lead the nation of Israel to victory over the Romans and establish Jerusalem as the capital of the whole earth. But instead, he just died shamefully. To turn that defeat into a spiritual victory meant rejecting their earlier beliefs about what kind of Messiah Jesus was supposed to be, which means admitting that they'd been completely wrong before. By telling stories on themselves about their initial failure to understand the teachings of Jesus, they was rejecting their original expectations of an earthly kingdom in order to replace it with the expectation of a heavenly one. In that context, it not only makes sense that they would emphasize their own failure to understand what Jesus was teaching, it's practically inevitable that they would do so. And that's what they teach to their own disciples, so that it became a major feature of early Christian tradition. And also, by the way, it would go a long way towards making a distinction between Christianity and the other apocalyptic Jewish sects. So no, it don't take no faith to believe that the New Testament writers would embellish stories of the disciples' many failings before the supposed resurrection. All it takes is a reasonable understanding of human nature and of the Christian fondness for before and after stories. And argument number 2 is going to be a deja vu. Quote, the New Testament writers include embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. End quote. It almost makes you wonder if they couldn't think up enough arguments to fill out a top 10 list, and so they had to do the first one twice. It's slightly different in that it's talking about Jesus instead of about the disciples, but it's still the same basic argument. They're still arguing that the New Testament writers wouldn't have included embarrassing details unless they was true. And Geisler and Turek cite the passage where Jesus' family said he was out of his mind, and various passages where folks don't believe him and accuse him of things that ain't true. And Geisler and Turek want us to think that this sort of stuff ought to be unthinkable to a New Testament writer. Quote, this is certainly not a list of events and qualities the New Testament writers would choose if they were trying to depict Jesus as the perfect, sinless God-man. Nor are these qualities congruent with the Jewish expectation that the Messiah would come to free them from political oppression. End quote. But see, that's the thing. The disciples of Jesus was also expecting the Messiah to free them from political oppression, and he didn't. The whole point of Christianity after the crucifixion was that the Jewish expectation was wrong, and the Gospels deliberately portrayed Jesus as shattering those expectations in order to make way for the expectation of a spiritual kingdom of God. Nor do any of these examples make Jesus look bad. The whole point of these passages is that the people who treated Jesus that way was wrong. They's the ones who end up looking bad in the Gospels, not Jesus. The idea that Jesus was, quote, despised and rejected by men, end quote, was a major theme of early Christianity, and these so-called embarrassing stories only serve to emphasize that theme. That's the suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53. Of course, the New Testament writers is going to portray Jesus as being falsely accused and rejected. But now, maybe I've been overly hard on Geisler and Turek because they also mention what they call the hard sayings of Jesus, such as his statement that, quote, the Father is greater than I, and his rebuke of the young ruler where he says, why do you call me God? No one is good but God alone. And also the passage where he says the Son doesn't know the day and the hour of the second coming. And that's a fair point. And in fact, it's a legitimate usage of the criterion of embarrassment, or at least sort of. See, the problem here is that in these passages, Jesus seems to be saying that he ain't God, and that's embarrassing to modern Christians because modern Christians believe he is God. And so these passages is what they call hard sayings. But in fact, these sayings ain't all that hard when you remember that a lot of first century Christians viewed Jesus not as an incarnation of God, but as a lesser being created by God and given authority over all of God's creation. The doctrine of the Trinity wasn't officially established until the 3rd century, and it was still controversial even then. So it's no surprise that the writers of the New Testament would include sayings that were consistent with Jesus not being God. Maybe they didn't think he was. And I know right away some folks is going to say, Jesus did claim to be God. Here's this passage and that passage and a bunch of other passages. And yes, you can read those passages and think that Jesus was claiming to be God. But you can also read them and think that Jesus was claiming to be God's representative, bearing God's delegated authority. A lot of early Christians did so, and that's why the doctrine of the deity of Christ was controversial on into the 3rd century and beyond. So the New Testament writers would have no problems writing passages that sounded to Trinitarians like Jesus is God, while also writing passages that sound like he ain't. Geisler and Turek mention other difficult passages as well, like his failed prediction to return within the lifetime of those to whom he was speaking. But that ain't a difficult saying at all, considering that the New Testament writers was still expecting Jesus to come back in their own lifetime. I mean, sure, it had to cause them some doubt when Peter and James and Paul all died, but hey, John hadn't died yet. I mean, he was getting pretty old, but as long as he weren't dead, Jesus' prophecy hadn't failed yet. And he was still alive when they wrote the Gospels, so it wouldn't have bothered them to include his prophecy in their texts. And that's the thing about the criterion of embarrassment. The way historians apply the criterion of embarrassment is by saying that if a passage contains details that's problematic to the folks who wrote and preserved it, the passage is more likely to be authentic. It don't mean the passage is necessarily true, but it's at least more likely to be authentic. So the only time the criterion of embarrassment is going to apply is when the text says things that cause actual problems for Christians, like the failed prophecies of Jesus. It's a valid historical technique when applied to certain specific passages to try and separate parts of the New Testaments that are likely to be authentic from parts that's probably invented or embellished. But Geisler and Turek is trying to use it to argue that the entire New Testament is reliable, and that just ain't how the criterion of embarrassment works. Let's move on. Here's number 3 on the top 10 list of why Geisler and Turek think we should believe everything the New Testament writers claim. Quote, "The New Testament writers left in demand and sayings of Jesus," end quote. And now I know they's padding their list. I mean, come on. They seriously arguing that the New Testament is reliable because the gospel writers didn't make Jesus sound like Joel Osteen? By this kind of reasoning, we can trust the Quran because Islam requires people to get down on their knees 5 times a day and pray towards Mecca. Plus, they also has to fast for the whole month of Ramadan, and that's even more demanding than Jesus was. But more importantly, the whole message of Christianity is that our obedience will never be perfect, and that's why Jesus died for us so our sins can be forgiven when we fall short. What difference does it make how demanding the religion is if you're automatically forgiven for free whenever you fail to meet those demands? Make it sound as hard as you like to impress the gullible, but it ain't going to pose no serious obstacle to believers. You'll hear evangelists and preachers even today emphasizing and even exaggerating the demands of the Christian faith to make both Christianity and Christians sound holier, because they know it don't really cost them nothing. And therefore it's entirely possible and even likely that the New Testament writers would have done the same. Number 4, quote, "The New Testament writers carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own," end quote. And this is grade A, 100% unadulterated horse apples. Geisler and Turek do not have an independent, verified, authoritative list of everything Jesus said that they can use to tell whether the New Testament writers always made a careful distinction between their own words and the words of Jesus. Geisler and Turek is taking one of the major liabilities of the New Testament text and trying to make it sound like a feature. Their own discussion shows us why this is a problem. Quote, "It would have been very easy for the New Testament writers to solve first-century theological disputes by putting words into Jesus' mouth. After all, if you were making up the Christianity story and trying to pass it off as the truth, wouldn't you simply make up more quotes from Jesus to convince stubborn people to see things your way?" End quote. And the answer, of course, is that they very likely would. The problem is that Geisler and Turek don't have any way to know that they didn't do exactly that. And not just with Jesus, neither. They could do it for any other character in the New Testament stories, like Matthew making up a dialogue between the Pharisees and the tomb guards conspiring to lie about disciples stealing the body. Matthew weren't there, and if there had been a conspiracy, a gospel writer was about the last person they would have gone to with a transcript of the conversation. No, Matthew just made it up. Geisler and Turek try to back up their claim by citing a passage in 1 Corinthians 7 where Paul states that he's given a personal opinion about something and not any command from the Lord. But that falls way far short of proving that all the New Testament writers always made a careful distinction between their own words and the words of Jesus. I mean, that don't even prove that Paul himself always made a careful distinction between his own words and the words of Jesus. The only claim Paul is making here is that this one time, concerning this one topic, he's saying something that's his own opinion and not a command from the Lord. That's it. Nowhere in the canonical New Testament does it ever say that the writers made a careful distinction, nor does it ever say that anybody even should make such a distinction. Geisler and Turek is inventing this whole idea, and all they got to back it up with is their own wishful thinking. They want it to be true, and therefore they assume it is true. And this is one of their 10 best arguments for why we ought to believe that the New Testament is trustworthy. Do you see why the poor quality of Christian apologetics played such a significant role in my own deconversion? Maybe argument number 5 will be better. Quote, the New Testament writers include events related to the resurrection that they would not have invented. End quote. No, I guess not. Geisler and Turek give 4 examples of stories they claim the New Testament writers would not have made up. The story of Joseph of Arimathea getting Jesus' body and putting it in a tomb, the story of the women discovering the empty tomb, the conversion of a large number of priests in Acts 6, and Matthew's story about the guards taking a bribe to lie about disciples stealing the body. But notice the binary thinking here. Geisler and Turek's strategy is to present the reliability of the New Testament as a black and white dichotomy. Either the whole thing is reliable, or else the whole thing is made up. They want us to think that if the New Testament writers reported any detail accurately, it means they reported every detail accurately. And that ain't the case at all. We need to look at each claim on its own merits, considered in the context and in the light of history and science. So let's do that. Let's take their first example about Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus' body. Now, I'm inclined to accept that one as more or less accurate on account of the standard Roman practice at the time was to either let crucified criminals rot on their crosses or else bury them in a mass grave reserved for disgraced criminals. If either one of those things had happened, there would never have been an empty tomb to kick off rumors of Jesus' apotheosis, and we probably wouldn't have a Christian religion today. And it makes sense that a member of the Sanhedrin would be the one to ask Pilate for the body, since the Roman authorities would only release the body to a member of the Sanhedrin, since they was the local religious authorities responsible for the handling of the dead, or else to a family member, assuming that the family was wealthy and influential enough to ask the government for a favor. And since Jesus' family was neither rich nor influential, that leaves the Sanhedrin. So I'm inclined to think that this one's accurate. As for the women at the tomb, I'm inclined to think that this one is accurate, although not for the reasons that Geisler and Turek give. They trot out the tired old argument that women was looked down on and their testimony was not regarded as trustworthy, and that's a bogus objection, because in every single gospel, the women immediately run and get a male disciple to corroborate their story. So the empty tomb story don't depend exclusively on the women's testimony, which invalidates the objection. On the other hand, if the body had been removed from the tomb, it makes sense that the women would be the first ones to find out, since they'd be the ones stuck with the dirty work of preparing the body for burial. So this one sounds plausible. As for the single line in Acts 6 verse 7 that claims many priests converted to Christianity, well, that one's a lot more doubtful. First of all, how many is a lot? Geisler and Turek's argument is that the people in Jerusalem would have known whether a lot of priests had converted or not, so it would have been dumb for Luke to make a false claim about how many had converted. That's a pretty spurious objection for a few reasons. Number one, the book of Acts was probably written in the latter decades of the first century, after the destruction of the temple, and was written for an audience of Gentile Greek-speaking believers, most of whom lived a long way from Jerusalem and would be unlikely to embark on a lengthy road trip just to fact-check a single line in a 28-chapter book. Plus, it's pretty naive to think that the authorities can overthrow a well-established, popular, evangelistic religion just by saying, well, it wasn't really all that many priests. I mean, come on. And incidentally, if so many priests converted, why don't any of them have names? You'd think at least one or two of them would be important enough to explicitly mention if they was priests and all. So no, I tend to think that Acts 6:7 was either made up or else exaggerated to make the story sound better. And that leaves Matthew's story about the guards. And this time he's absolutely talking about a story that Matthew just made up. as a plausible way to deny the widespread reports that disciples had stolen the body. Not only does Matthew report the exact words of a conversation he never heard and that no one would have shared with him, but he portrays the Pharisees as being worried that people would hear about the tomb and think that Jesus had risen from the dead. And I did a whole video on this, but the gist of it is that if you's a Pharisee and you just executed the Son of God and he just done come back from the dead, the last thing you's going to be concerned about is an empty hole in the ground. All they know, according to the story, is that he's come back to life. As far as they know, he's in Jerusalem right now heading for the temple. Now, you and I know that the story says Jesus ascended into heaven 40 days after the resurrection. But it ain't 40 days after the resurrection yet. The Pharisees ain't got any way to know what's supposed to happen in the next part of the story. And yet, they ain't the least bit interested in where Jesus is or what Jesus is doing. All they care about is a hole in the ground. And that's cause this whole story weren't invented until decades after the fact, after Jesus had supposedly departed the earth and the empty tomb was the only tangible evidence they had to worry about. Matthew just made it all up because everybody in and around Jerusalem knew that disciples had taken the body and he needed a counter-narrative to convince believers not to listen. And that's why you can't just claim that the New Testament is either 100% reliable or 100% false. You have to take each claim on its own merits and consider all the evidence. And this is a good stopping place for today. I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but we made it halfway through their list of the top 10 arguments, and that's good progress. Next time we'll see if we can't finish up their list and draw some conclusions about how reliable the New Testament really is. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.